Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. The International Atomic Energy Agency said there are indications that North Korea might be working to extract plutonium that could be used for nuclear weapons. And so far, the North Korean regime has not said anything particular about the Biden administration's North Korean policy, although the State Department has made it clear that the U.S. reached out to North Korea. Today, we'll discuss these with two former U.S. diplomats who were directly involved in North Korea policy in the past. Joining me is Revere, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Revere served as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Robert Einhorn also joins me today. Currently Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution, Ambassador Einhorn served as the State Department Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control in the Obama administration. Welcome to the program. Good to have both of you today.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
The IAEA said North Korea's nuclear activities remain a cause for serious concern, suspecting North Korea is producing plutonium. Mr. Revere, what's your thought on the IAEA's latest assessment on North Korea?
Well, I think the first thing that bears saying is that the IAEA is recognizing the reality of what we're facing right now, and the IAEA is recognizing as well the fact that North Korea earlier this year, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, earlier this year, made it very clear that the DPRK intends to continue to develop its nuclear weapons program, expand and enhance its nuclear weapons program, as well as its ballistic missile delivery system program. So the IAEA report is a very useful reminder of the stark reality that we face, and that reality was explained to us very clearly by the North Korean leader in his speech to the Party Congress in January of this year.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Einhorn, the IAEA's assessment, this isn't new, is it?
No, it's not. And you mentioned the recent report about reprocessing it at Yongbyon. Actually, all that the IAEA has, all that anyone has really, is commercial photography indicating that there's activity at the reprocessing site, but no determination could be made whether they're actually engaged in reprocessing. It's important to know that the IAEA no longer has any on-ground access in North Korea. The IAEA was expelled by the North Koreans years ago. What it has is commercial satellite photography. It can read the public estimates of countries like the United States. And it's more familiar with Yongbyon than anywhere else because the IAEA was in Yongbyon before. But it really doesn't know what's going on at undeclared nuclear activities outside Yongbyon, where a lot of production activities taking place. So anything the IAEA says about North Korea is really an estimate, and those estimates are very uncertain.
The State Department said because of these suspected nuclear activities in North Korea, the U.S. government conducted the North Korean policy review. And we know that the Biden administration reached out to the North Korean regime at least twice. Is this a one-sided effort from the U.S. side, Ambassador Einhorn?
Well, it takes two to tango. Yes, the State Department reached out soon after the Biden administration took office, but the North Koreans weren't interested. Their public comments suggested they weren't interested in engagement, that engagement would be useless as long as the United States maintained what they considered to be U.S. hostile policy. Now, perhaps they were waiting for the conclusion of the U.S. nuclear posture review. Perhaps they were waiting for President Moon's visit to Washington. But even after the conclusion of the review and the Moon visit, there have been no real reaction, no authoritative reactions from the North Korean side. Perhaps they are waiting for the Biden administration to take some unilateral steps of its own. But the Biden people have made clear that they're not going to do that. It's a cliche, I know, but it really is true. The ball really is in North Korea's court.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Revere, the U.S. calling on North Korea to engage in dialogue, Will this effort be fruitful when North Korea seems to be continuing expanding its nuclear arsenal?
Well, as Ambassador Einhorn suggested at the beginning of his comments, it takes two to tango. It takes two to play this game. And the United States is rightly stressing its preparedness to engage in a dialogue with North Korea. The problem is that the sort of dialogue that the United States wants to engage in with North Korea is not the sort of dialogue that North Korea is looking for. The United States wants to have a conversation about denuclearization and how to achieve that long-standing goal. North Korea, on the other hand, as Kim Jong-un reminded us in January, wants to have a very different conversation. He laid out a roadmap, a game plan for the expansion and enhancement of his nuclear weapons program, and reminded us again that North Korea regards itself as a de facto nuclear weapons state and intends to remain as such. And so the conversation that the North Koreans might want to have is a conversation about how to get the United States and the international community ultimately to accept it in one form or another as a de facto nuclear power. And so as long as we have a situation in which the two sides are looking to have a very different conversation from each other, I think we're in a bit of a fix and a bit of a box right now. And I don't see any near-term resolution of that.
Mm-hmm. Some people view that the Biden administration's North Korean policy is not much different from the Obama administration's so-called strategic patience. Meanwhile, Stephen Biegun, former Deputy Secretary of State and former Special Representative for North Korea, has recently said the Biden team's North Korean policy seems to be a continuation of what the Trump team was doing. How do you see this, Mr. Revere?
Well, interesting that you use the term Trump team. I think if you look back during the 4 years of the Trump administration, there was a policy effort being pursued by the team and very capably led by Steve Biegun. But there was also a parallel policy being pursued by the President of the United States, who seemed to have some very different views about North Korea, about ballistic missiles, especially short and medium range ones, about giving up military exercises with the ROK, et cetera. And so there were some very contradictory moments during that policy. But if what Steve Biegun was talking about was the application of sanctions, the use of sanctions, the application of pressure, the isolation of North Korea, and the continuation of a policy of keeping the heat on North Korea, then there is a very direct line of continuity between, let's say, the last 2 years of the Obama administration, all 4 years of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. There is an element of continuity here because sanctions remain in place, the pressure remains on, denuclearization remains the goal, and the United States, at least based on what we've seen so far, appears to be committed to maintaining all of those elements of its policy, even while it reaches out its hand to North Korea and encourages Pyongyang to engage in dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Einhorn, what's your view on Biden administration's North Korean policy?
Well, so far, after the conclusion of the policy review, the Biden team hasn't provided many details about its policy. It's often spoken about what the policy is not. So it's not a grand bargain. It's not strategic patience. The administration will not make the same mistakes of its predecessors. But in talking about what the policy is, the administration has used hard to criticize terms like pragmatic and practical and measured and calibrated. It's understandable, I guess, that it's not providing many details. It wants to preserve negotiating flexibility. It wants time to consult with allies. It believes negotiations will be more effective if conducted in private. And on a lot of issues, they simply haven't made decisions. The Biden team remains committed to the ultimate goal of complete denuclearization, but I don't think anyone on the Biden team has any expectations that can be achieved in the foreseeable future. They're prepared to pursue a long-term approach to complete denuclearization and to proceed on an incremental basis. Another term for that is step by step. And it will focus, I think, initially on particular threats that the administration believes that the North poses to the United States and its allies, and it will pursue partial measures to deal with those particular problems rather than to achieve some kind of what it says is a grand bargain. I guess in baseball terms, you would say that it's going to try to go for singles and doubles rather than home runs.
Ambassador Einhorn, I want to ask one more question here. The Congressional Research Service said in its report earlier in May that there is a dominant view among experts in Washington that North Korea will never voluntarily give up its nuclear programs, even if incentives are given. Ambassador, do you share this concern?
I do. In fact, I don't really know anyone who believes that Kim Jong-un has any intention to abandon the nuclear deterrent that he believes is critical to the survival of his regime. No, I think that's an accurate assessment. People believe that if someday North Korea is prepared to abandon its deterrent, it will be only on the basis of a fundamental transformation of North Korea's orientation and perhaps a change of leadership, change of regime in North Korea. But in the foreseeable future, no one believes it's going to happen.
Mr. Revere?
I would tend to agree with that. If the goal is the denuclearization of North Korea, we're running out of options to achieve that. I mean, one way to achieve that goal is for the North Korean regime to end. That would resolve the problem. Another way of doing it would be to pursue a policy of regime change. Neither of those two things is likely, and quite frankly, would break a lot of crockery, if you will. And so I think North Korea has achieved its long-sought goal of becoming a de facto nuclear power. They intend to remain that. They've told us so many times, including at the senior-most levels of the regime. And so our challenge right now is, while maintaining that long-term goal of denuclearizing North Korea, how do we manage this very, very difficult problem? How do we manage the threat, not only to the United States, but of course to our allies in the region? And so that is the matter at hand for the Biden administration, and it's quite a challenge. But I would concur with my colleague and with others who have said that there really is no prospect for the achievement of a denuclearized North Korea in the near term.
Following the Biden-Moon summit last month, there are growing calls within the South Korean government that the inter-Korean engagement needs to be pushed in order to make a breakthrough. Ambassador Einhorn, will the inter-Korean tourism be a good start for diplomacy with North Korea?
Well, President Moon must have been delighted at the summit with President Biden's support for inter-Korean relations. After the summit, President Moon reiterated his view that initial steps in inter-Korean relations would create a virtuous circle. What he means by that is that these initial inter-Korean steps would facilitate progress on the nuclear issue. Now, U.S. administrations have been dubious about that kind of virtuous circle. In their view, and I think in the view of the Biden administration too, it's important that inter-Korean relations not get very far ahead of progress on the nuclear issue. We'll see what happens as a result of this summit understanding on inter-Korean relations. Perhaps the Biden administration will be amenable to some initial steps that are not precluded by existing sanctions, but we'll have to see on that.
Mr. Revere, your thought on South Korea pushing for inter-Korean projects?
Well, I have the same view about the outcome of the U.S. ROK summit. I think it was good for the leaders to come to an understanding, despite some U.S. misgivings about the value of North-South engagement and the policy of conciliation that President Moon has pursued. But the main obstacle right now to any sort of North-South engagement is the fact that Pyongyang is not interested in it and has made it very clear, using some rather contemptuous language to describe President Moon, his administration, the ROK in general over a long period of time. And it's fairly clear that the real target that North Korea is interested in terms of engaging in any kind of a conversation is the United States, not the ROK. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen during the course of the Moon administration is that the DPRK has come to take the South for granted. And so it believes that it can be rather dismissive of the ROK, and the ROK will still reciprocate with the sort of language and assurances that we've been hearing from President Moon, the unification minister, and others. I think that's unfortunate. All of the goodwill that South Korea has extended towards North Korea has certainly not been reciprocated. And in fact, it's resulted in some rather insulting language that the ROK has received. And it's too bad, but that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Revere, so there are many people argue that in the end, what North Korea really wants is sanctions relief. Do you think how the Biden administration said it will take a gradual, phased approach has any implications on North Korea sanctions?
Well, hidden in that language, potentially, could be a willingness to engage in some easing of sanctions. But I think the president has made clear, and others in the administration have made clear, that any steps that the United States would take would have to be taken in conjunction with significant steps towards denuclearization by North Korea. Officials in the administration have made that clear time and time again. And as we've seen over the last several years, particularly in terms of what happened at the summit in Hanoi, that's not really a deal that's acceptable to North Korea. And so we're stuck at this point until one side or the other softens its position. But I think it's right for the United States to hold out the possibility, the potential for some sanctions easing. But the reality is that the DPRK does not seem to be interested in taking those substantial and irreversible steps that it would need to take to bring about that outcome.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Einhorn, do you see any possibility this administration will act differently about North Korea sanctions?
I think the Biden team has made clear that it's prepared to offer partial sanctions relief in exchange for partial steps on the nuclear issue. But I think it's also conscious that even after offering this partial relief for partial steps, it will want to retain significant sanctions in order to have the leverage necessary to get the North Koreans to move further down the path to denuclearization. And so I think it will adopt an approach that makes sanctions relief commensurate, very strictly commensurate with the steps that the North Koreans are prepared to take. So modest sanctions relief for modest nuclear steps, reversible sanctions relief for reversible nuclear steps. And I don't think the Biden team is going to be prepared to take unilateral steps before the North Koreans show they're prepared to be serious about denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, there are even some views that international sanctions are restricting North Korea's import of goods and affecting people's access to aid. However, the State Department maintains that North Korean regime is wholly responsible for exploiting its own citizens. What should we make of this?
I agree with the State Department that the North Korean regime bears most of the responsibility for the dire, conditions that North Koreans have to live under. Their, poor economic policies, and the conditions have been greatly exacerbated in the last year by the near total lockdown that was imposed because of the COVID pandemic. But of course, sanctions have contributed to some of the difficult conditions faced by the North Korean public. And reportedly, sanctions have inhibited NGO relief workers from operating effectively in the North. And, I think, at an early stage, the United States could give more of a green light to humanitarian workers to operate in North Korea. And perhaps it's possible to facilitate North Korean access to medical supplies and other humanitarian goods in order to deal with some of the suffering that the North Korean people have had to endure.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Revere, what do you say to those NGOs who claim that their activities are affected by the sanctions?
I think there's a good case to be made that some of the sanctions unfortunately have an untoward impact on some of the work of the NGOs. And I would agree with Ambassador Einhorn that the United States at some point should see what it could do to ease the burden that some of these NGOs are bearing right now, particularly in much needed areas of humanitarian support and assistance to the people of North Korea. But at the end of the day, anybody who's ever been to North Korea and spent any time in the country has certainly observed that the major problems that North Korea is suffering from are problems of horrifically bad economic decision-making, the prioritization of nuclear weapons and military buildups over humanitarian assistance to their own people, and a complete ignorance when it comes to some of the fundamental lessons that so many other countries have learned about how to modernize and improve their economy, particularly the agricultural economy.
Mm-hmm. My last question today. At this stage, what is the next practical step the U.S. government can take towards North Korea? Mr. Revere first.
I think the steps that the United States has already taken have sent an adequate message and a very clear message to North Korea that if North Korea is interested in a dialogue, the United States is prepared to have that dialogue. That message was recently reinforced by Deputy Secretary Sherman, but a whole range of U.S. government officials, including the President himself, have made it clear that there's a dialogue to be had and the United States is prepared to have it. And to repeat what Ambassador Einhorn said a little bit earlier in our discussion, the ball is literally in Pyongyang's court at this point. So I think the onus is on the DPRK to come forward and say, okay, let's have that conversation. We'll see where it goes from there.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, your final thought?
I completely agree with Evans on that. The ball is in North Korea's court. The Biden administration has done everything reasonable to get North Koreans to the table, even after the summit. The Biden team has reached out, has urged the Chinese to help bring North Korea to the table. It should do what it's been doing. It should consult closely with its allies, try to get them on board, a common policy, consult with China, try to get China's help. It should continue to work to strengthen the alliance, to ensure that alliance defense and deterrence capabilities are adequate. It should press the Chinese and the Russians to enforce sanctions more conscientiously. All of these elements are necessary for successful negotiations. But North Korea has to be interested in those negotiations, and that hasn't happened so far.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said North Korea poses an increasing threat to the United States and its allies, with ambitions to be able to strike the U.S. homeland. While the Biden administration stresses it is putting diplomacy first in dealing with threats from North Korea, North Korean regime appears to keep developing its nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. Mr. Revere and Ambassador Einhorn, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.